Welcome to the Climate Pelicans Brief, a podcast bridging the gap between climate science and Louisiana frontline communities. I'm Corinne Salter.
And I'm Jill Tapizza. Join us as we disentangle environmental justice issues facing Louisiana using peer-reviewed science as well as the voices and lived experiences of community leaders.
Our goals are to uplift activist platforms and raise awareness about the many environmental puzzles in Louisiana,
while contextualizing everything through the lens of climate crisis mitigation. Welcome back to another episode of the Climate Pelicans Brief. Today we bring an exciting topic that's really been on the minds of a lot of Louisianians. Is it Louisianians or is it Louisianans?
Louisianan is the universal term. Louisianian is what Louisianians prefer.
That's really funny to me. Okay, we're going to continue. We're not even going to cut that because I think so we all wanted to know.
Yeah, honestly, because I was like, I've only ever heard my mom refer to people from Louisiana as Louisianians. And so I would say it, but then I'm like,
it feels wrong.
But then I would hear people like in more like national spaces, more universal spaces, say Louisianans. So I was like, that's interesting. So while I was writing this, I looked it up and I was like, what is preferred? And I think it was like on Reddit or something, people that were from Louisiana they were basically like, yeah, we prefer Louisianians if you are from Louisiana, but if you're not or just want to relay this information or like use a term that's like more universally accepted, it's Louisianans. So I was like, very interesting, because I've only ever heard my mom say Louisianians.
That's so interesting. Yeah. Thank you for sharing. Yeah, I'm glad we always have to use our language to delineate like where the residents are versus who are the outsiders. Who's really from New York.
It's so funny.
Okay, so we are on an exciting topic, and it's not about the language we use to describe ourselves.
Not about dialects.
No, it's not about Louisiana dialects, because like that's a whole other topic that I don't know anything about. So we have an exciting topic that's really been on the minds of a lot of Louisianians, and honestly, I feel like it's also on the minds of a lot of Americans in general, and that is environmental justice. Mm-hmm. So environmental justice is going to be a recurring theme. It's something that Climate Pelicans mission really hinges on, and it's something that affects both of us personally, of course, and a lot of us greatly. So today we're really just going to give a primer into environmental justice and its impacts on society and public health. And then throughout our series, we will delve deeper into the racialized social processes that shape environmental justice, not just in Louisiana, but also at large. We'll plan to hear a lot from community members throughout the series as this theme recurs, specifically members from EJ communities or environmental justice communities, who have different perspective and different experiences that fall under this umbrella term of environmental justice. So this is a pretty big issue, and I thought maybe we could kick off our episode by chatting about what environmental justice means to us individually, Climate Pelicans as an organization as well. We can talk about why we care and why other people should care too. And Cori, since you are our Louisianian on air today,
right?
Would you like to go first?
Yeah, definitely. So I really love the idea of talking about like what environmental justice means to us individually, but also, of course, like to Climate Pelicans in general, because like, why do we care? Why did we start Climate Pelicans with this mission of environmental justice? So I can definitely talk about like my personal experience with environmental justice. A lot of what I study has to do with environmental justice, and so it's really a big passion of mine, and I like to say that it's like really hard coded into my life at this point, not just professionally but also personally. So it's like something that I always say I can't get away from it, and that sounds like so downtrodden, honestly, but like for me, it's something that I can't get away from because I care about it so much, but also just because it impacts like so many aspects of my life. Like as you mentioned before, I'm from Louisiana, or at least I was raised here, and so my entire family is from Louisiana. But a little about me. I was born in the Marshall Islands, and a lot of people know about the Marshall Islands for the fact that anthropogenic climate change is causing it to sink underwater. And a lot of the people of the Marshall Islands, my people, are losing their homes and their livelihoods because of industrialization and greenhouse gas emissions, which have caused this rapid climate change. But I was also adopted as a baby. So I was adopted pretty much a week after I was born. And it was like an arranged adoption. And my adoptive family is all from Louisiana. So all of them are native Louisianians. And so I was raised throughout Baton Rouge and bounced kind of between here and Ascension and Livingston Parish throughout my entire life, pretty much. But I have family that's all from Louisiana. So I have a lot of family that's from New Orleans, from Lafayette, Slidell, Zachary, Sabine, not Alexandria, Virginia or anything, but Alec, Louisiana, Lake Charles, all different parts of Louisiana. And yeah, I think the thing that I connect with most between both of those places, so I have a home country that's, like I said, dealing with all these issues related to climate change, sinking underwater, having all these really, really intense and more intensifying natural disasters that are occurring, natural weather events that are making it really hard to sustain life in the Marshall Islands. And then that really also has to do with Louisiana as well. Like I said, I've lived here my entire life. And that's really the idea of like environmental justice, is that certain communities and places kind of bear this unequal burden of environmental risks without any equal say in their outcomes. And a lot of times this lack of equality in outcomes is heavily racialized. And so that's something that both the Marshall Islands and Louisiana both deal with a lot. For instance, the Marshall Islands contributed very little of the greenhouse gas emissions in 2019, but is on the front line for climate change impacts, while the U.S. has contributed, as we know, quite a bit. There's a number of like 6,340.2 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents in greenhouse gas emissions. Yet we see countries like the Marshall Islands being on the front line for a lot of this, despite them contributing very little to anthropogenic climate change.
Yeah, and I see you've got a number for the Marshall Islands here too. So I'll share that as well. 164.92 is that kilotons of greenhouse gas emissions in 2019. So that's 6,000 plus versus 164. That's a pretty big disparity.
Yeah, I would say so.
And very little say in what happens. Like you think you put things into the world and it comes back to you in equal parts, but EJ is just the story of that not happening. Right. And so that's really not much that the Marshall Islands contribute to greenhouse gas emissions versus the climate impacts that they're seeing. So it must feel really frustrating to have to beg for all that support and climate policy change while not being a large contributor to climate change at all. You're kind of responsible for cleaning up the mess that other people have made.
Yeah, exactly. It's extremely frustrating. And I've really seen that a lot more recently because I recently have become a part of a nonprofit that educates Marshallese people and basically anyone who will listen about the like the people listening right now about the effects of climate change and what they're doing basically to the Marshall, what effect it's having on the Marshall Islands. And basically like what we're here to do too is try to get people to care about the people who are suffering through not much fault of their own, except for falling basically just too low on the totem pole and not being able to have that sort of equity in their voice being heard in these outcomes. And so Louisiana, like I said, it has a similar story. You know, we have places like Cancer Alley, which is only an 85-mile stretch of Louisiana, but accounts for 25% of petrochemical production in the U.S. And obviously, like in producing those petrochemicals, there's emissions that drastically affect air quality for those living in and around these production facilities. And with that comes a heightened risk of cancer, which is what has given it its name that so many people may know it by. So yeah, I really have like a lot of environmental justice issues kind of hard coded into my life, my ancestry. Like no matter where I go, I'm always kind of like still connected to it in some way.
Thanks for sharing all of that and why it applies to you. I'm curious to know, can you share the name of the nonprofit that you just are a part of?
Yeah, so it's based in Arkansas. Kind of weird because actually a lot of the Marshallese diaspora has moved over to Arkansas for a number of overlapping, usually racialized reasons. And so it's based in Arkansas in Springfield, and it's called the Marshallese Education Initiative. And basically we just try to talk about educate, young Marshallese people who may not know about the effects that climate change are having on the Marshall Islands, but then also just like let everybody who will listen, like I said, let them know about those effects of climate change, what we're dealing with, and kind of just be like a voice for, just trying to bring more power and more justice to the climate change movement, because a lot of times it is people like the Marshallese that are going to be bearing the brunt of the burden of that.
I love that this nonprofit exists.
Yeah.
There's so many like small places that are doing such good work out there. So thanks for sharing that with us.
Of course.
So I know we said we both share about what environmental justice means to us, and I don't study it professionally like you do, but I definitely have grown to see it as a really big issue. So for me, I've always been aware of EJ as like an academic sense. Like I knew the facts about it, but it didn't really become very tangible to me until I moved to Louisiana. And unlike other states, you see these lines drawn along contribution to greenhouse gas emissions, race, socioeconomic status, and the physical health of residents, like you were talking about with the petrochemical facilities causing cancer risks for the residents.
Yeah.
And in Baton Rouge, which is where we're located, there are still these divides. It's not even just like all over Louisiana, specifically like, in my neighborhood, in the neighborhood next door, things like that. And they're very, very obvious if you come from another place. You see these low-income housing placed on low-lying ground closest to the levee, which are also the areas of greatest flood risk. That's EJ right there, big flag.
Right, yeah.
You're putting people who can't afford other places, like at the area where they're going to get flooded every couple of years. Not fair. You see higher rates of cancer, asthma, COPD in some neighborhoods more than others. That was apparent to me when I did my EMT certification. So I don't have a lot of like experience out serving the community, but I did have the chance to participate on ambulance rides and like different types of neighborhoods, and it's amazing the different calls you get depending on where you're located.
Right.
And a lot of these neighborhoods that are like lower socioeconomic status, that are placed in like these more environmentally precarious areas, you do see those higher rates of calls that are associated with like difficulty breathing or just like a compounding health issues.
Yeah.
Whereas in other neighborhoods you don't get that. You get like, accidents, fell off your roof, I don't know, stuff like that. And so like this is not just a coincidence, these divides, and it's really difficult to ignore once you see it happening around you. So for me personally, injustice of any kind really ruffles my feathers. So EJ is something that matters to me, so I'm glad we're talking about it today, and I'm glad we're going to continue to talk about it throughout this series.
Yeah, me too, especially because like I feel like we have just two completely different perspectives on EJ, even though it's like, we obviously still care about it in the same ways, but we have like different experiences because, we've just gone through different things and, we've lived in different areas. And so like, that's why I think it's so important to have these like different perspectives and like different experiences with it, because at the end of the day, we both still care about it and we both still see it as an issue that needs to be tackled, which is why we're part of Climate Pelicans. But yeah, at the end of the day, it really is just how your power relationships influence the ways in which certain marginalized communities are able to meaningfully contribute to environmental decision-making outcomes. Because like, we both know, as scientists, the natural environment and the things that we do in it, especially how we regulate it or we don't, or how we apply different protections unequally, protections of the environment, that's going to have drastic impacts on the people and the species that are living in it. So it's not that the environment itself is really discriminating against certain groups over others. It's that the resources within those environments and those resources' health are unfairly applied and allocated. So the protections of those certain resources and who it's given to, and then what protections are given to who, those types of things are kind of like where it comes down to environmental justice, because, you know, so many of our systems are racialized, that it's just naturally going to have this impact over how the environment is regulated too. Like, the environment is no different. It's still subject to certain laws and policies that can be applied discriminately.
You're so right. And you mentioned that it's not the environment itself that's discriminatory, right? Like, Mother Nature is, you know,
she doesn't have it out for us.
She doesn't have it out for us.
Right.
Like, this is not saying that you live in a particular place, like, just naturally you're, you know, in a better off state versus living somewhere else. This is like, Mother Nature really is here to care for us. So that's not what environmental justice framework is claiming.
Right.
I'm hearing that right.
Yeah.
That it's like, it's about the resources that humans are allocating, and it has nothing to do with the natural environment.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like, you know, just basically, well, we're going to get into this a little bit, but basically the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, it defines environmental justice as the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. So that's kind of like a mouthful, but it's basically saying, like, what we're saying is that, you know, environmental quality and the environmental risk exposure a lot of times are going to come from the fair treatment and meaningful involvement that certain people are allowed. So the fact that the EPA has to like kind of line that out, it shows you that a lot of times there is not fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of their identities. So that's kind of where environmental justice really like comes in, is that people should have that equality and say, and equality and protection that comes from having that equal say.
So just to like dig into that a little bit more, can you mention like the specific amendments that allow the EPA to do that, and what language is actually used?
Yeah, so basically it's the 5th and the 14th Amendment in the U.S. that the U.S. government has. So basically the U.S. government has a responsibility to ensure a clean and healthy environment to all citizens, regardless of race, creed, color, or sex. And so that's kind of like where environmental justice, like I said, comes in, is that even though they have this requirement based on our amendment rights, every single citizen has the rights to this, they don't always I shouldn't say they, generally speaking, but a lot of times we just don't see those rights fairly applied.
So like a lot of other like intersectional issues that were created in the amendments, the Constitution, we're also now seeing those all along environmental lines.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
Okay, that's what you're saying.
Yeah.
So the unfair application of these rights and protections is a big part of environmental justice in that framework. Can you dive just like a little bit deeper into that for our curious listeners?
Yeah. So I kind of touched on this a little bit before, but it's basically the idea that the environment is regulated and the rights to a healthy environment are protected and upheld by regulatory bodies. And these regulatory bodies that protect the environment really aren't too different from the same that regulate our rights and create our policies and regulations related to other issues. So that's something, I mean, I'm not sure about y'all, but it's something that I've been hearing about all the time lately. The fact that unless you're basically an old cis straight rich white man, you and your interests are probably not going to be the best represented by these regulatory bodies. And that's why we see things like anti-trans bills, anti-LGBTQIA plus legislation coming out, and anti-diversity bills. The mess that is happening in Florida right now with Common Core, and how the history of slavery and racism is being taught in schools, you know, you name it. There's so many different things that we see in our regulatory bodies, like whether it be local, state, federal, that are not always representative of the little people, of the people that are going to be disempowered communities that are going to be on the front line of industrial inundation. That's basically kind of the idea, that we have all these people that are making our laws and our policies related to the environment, and they don't even live in the communities that are being hardest hit by environmental justice issues.
Yeah, and I mean, that makes sense, because that's something we say for our mission in Climate Pelicans, is that no one can speak for communities better than its members.
Yeah.
And it's so easy to deny or ignore the injustices taking place against certain communities if you're literally not from those communities.
Exactly.
Like, what do you know?
Right.
And I think that highlights the need, just the overall need for a more diverse representation in these decision making, as well as the regulatory bodies like the EPA that you're talking about.
Right. And like, that's like the issue is like we're saying, the natural environment itself is not discriminatory, but the people who make the laws and the protections and, you know, really make the regulations for what can go on in the environment and who has the right to release certain emissions and who has to be bearing the brunt of those emissions, those are going to be naturally discriminatory, because if we think about the people that are representing us at the highest levels of legislation, it's not extremely representative. But like, it makes sense because it's out of sight, out of mind. Like you said, if they're not from these communities, then it's so easy to be like, oh yeah, we need to have these certain industries set up in certain areas. So why don't we send these toxic facilities to places that we don't live, because you don't want them in your backyard, so where are they going to go? You know, put them in the places that you don't live in.
Yeah, they go to the backyards of the people who don't have a seat at the table regularly to say, no, I don't want this in my backyard. I don't want you to set this facility up here. Because they're really looking at from like a profit lens, and they're strategic about it too. They're not going to try to set it up in a neighborhood when they know that there's a lot of community support for, you know, different things that go on in the community. They're gonna pick on the little guys. They're gonna pick on some people who don't have a seat at the table. Basically,
yeah, exactly. And that's the thing that basically environmental justice is saying, the seat at the table. We see that those seats are not fairly given, because really environmental policy making is really no different than policy making in any other arena. It's politicized, it's discriminatory naturally, because policy is being decided by a very few unrepresentative people. And that's what environmental justice says is, well, that's what the EPA says, especially about environmental justice, is that regardless of our identities, all citizens should have the right to contribute to environmental decision making equally. And the environmental protections that we're afforded should genuinely be applied evenly. And that's what we see with environmental justice issues, is that this definitely doesn't always happen. That's where the disconnect is between just and unjust environmental outcomes, is that seat at the table. Who's it given to? Who's making the decisions that are going to ultimately affect groups of people that they may not even be able to represent in an equitable way?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think like just something to add on to that would be that the like the EPA fund, like it's not just who works for the EPA or like who is making our policies. Also, it's, you know, the funding cycles in the EPA. It's under the federal government. So like we saw a couple of years ago when, you know, he who must not be named decided to cut back funding on the EPA, you know, firing a lot of people, putting people in different positions. It's things like that that are also affecting, like, you know, who gets those protections. Like the EPA is a definite body of like defined resources, like a limited resource pool of like people, and it's the people who have a seat at the table who get those protections, and the people who don't, who are like, oh, sorry, we don't have enough funding to like actually regulate the sulfur oxides coming out of this toxic facility for you, so like just deal with it,
just deal
yourself.
With it.
We're just gonna tell you about it. So that little rant, so that lack of equal protections and rights to contribute meaningfully in environmental outcomes, we see how that can happen. So what does that ultimately lead to?
Well, yeah, like for instance, minoritized communities are more likely to be surrounded by hazardous waste treatment, storage, or disposal facilities, and low-income neighborhoods tend to have more landfills and waste transfer stations. And with these types of facilities, it introduces a host of issues.
Wow, that's just like the mosaic of America. Right now. Like this is just like how it's been. It's just how it's set up, and it hurts so bad to look at it. I can imagine that the people who are in those communities that have those disposal or storage or waste treatment facilities, they don't want that in their neighborhood. I'm sure they're aware of them. Like you can see in Louisiana, there's like a quiet little neighborhood, like a giant bright lights, like constantly blowing smoke in their faces thing.
Terrible
like,
smells
in the background. Like I've seen some really harrowing pictures, and like I've driven by some things that I'm like, is that real right now? So like the people who have these in their backyards, like they didn't invite that.
Right.
And so like that, I guess that kind of contributes to this idea of NIMBY-ism, which I know you wanted to touch on. You want to explain NIMBY for our listeners?
Yeah. So basically NIMBY it's an acronym for not in my backyard. And so that's what NIMBY-ism really is like, don't put that in my backyard. Okay, well, if it's not put in somebody's backyard, in a certain community's backyard, then it has to go somewhere. And so the flip side of NIMBY-ism, unfortunately, because of the racialized social structures that we have in the US, it introduces the flip side of that, which is PIBBY-ism, a term that's been used by certain scholars, which basically means put it in blacks' backyards. So that means, well, if it's not going to go into these communities, like you said, the communities that have that sort of support and social capital to be able to push back against these industries, well, then where is it going to go? It's going to go to a group of people who have been so historically and contemporarily marginalized and disempowered to the point that they're not going to be able to have that equality and say, no, we don't want that here, put it somewhere else, or just don't put it anywhere at all. They're not going to have that equality of say, so it's going to go into their backyards, and unfortunately they're going to end up being disadvantaged even further because of that. And so yeah, that's kind of the thing, is that there are groups of people that have more political, social, financial, economic clout, and a lot of these powers that they have, this clout that they have, are going to be based on pre-existing power dynamics, which are heavily racialized. I mean, not even that long ago, we still had slavery. We still had, institutions like Jim Crow laws, and, especially in places like the Deep South, which, really are based off of those racialized power structures. And I mean, they're still pertinent today. That means that a lot of the allocations of resources, including protections against industry being set up in your backyard, are going to be something that we're still going to see today. And I think that, honestly, environmental justice issues such as places like Cancer Alley, such heavy areas of like concentrated inequality in environmental protection, are going to be a result of the social power structures and racialized power structures that we've seen in our history that are still showing their ugly heads today. I mean, it's not like it just went away just because we decided that slavery was illegal. Like, that's not how it goes. And so for certain communities to maintain that feeling of like NIMBY-ism, and to be able to maintain that, basically saying, hey, we don't want these in our backyards, for them to not have those places in their backyards, those facilities in their backyards, it's going to have to go to other places. So these locally unwanted land uses, also known as LULUs, such as hazardous waste treatment facilities and landfills, they have to go somewhere. And like I said, what groups have been so historically and contemporarily disenfranchised and marginalized that they won't necessarily have the capital to push these places out of their homes and quite literally out of their backyards?
And that would be your communities of color and your low-income communities. And these are things that we're seeing in research come up over and over and over again. This is not a coincidence. This is not just a phenomenon of life. Like, this is a product of what you just talked about. Yeah. Which is just crazy. And it's like, a lot of people think that America is democracy, and it totally is in some ways. Mm-hmm. But when you're putting up a power plant, or when you're putting up a waste treatment facility or storage, or like we're going to talk a lot about in the future, like a carbon capture and storage facility, it's not a vote. It's not, where are we going to put this based on what everybody wants? It's like a fight to the death. Mm-hmm. And it's like they try to put it up in this neighborhood. There's too much community support. The community literally rallies around. Everybody pushes everything out of their schedule to go to public meetings and really fight companies on this. And eventually the company backs down sometimes, and then they move on to the next community. And it's, where are they going to find it where there's like nobody showing up to those meetings, nobody who can but they're not having those meetings, they're not advertising them publicly, places where they feel like they can get away with this.
And that's the thing, is like, that's the whole idea of like the capital to be able to show up and like, really push these facilities out. It's like, basically capital can refer to, like, do they have family members or people who see their side in political power? And so obviously, like, that could be a racialized issue too. You know, like if you see a community, like some community in Louisiana that you maybe never go through, you don't have any family that lives there, it's just a little rural town in Louisiana, like, and you don't have any sort of like connection to them whatsoever. If they're even, okay, let's say like they get media attention, if you see them on the media talking about how they have these industry facilities that are setting up in their backyard, you're not necessarily going to feel compelled to understand or empathize with what they're going through, because it doesn't affect you in that way. And because that is such like a racialized thing as well, you're going to see maybe like Black communities that are trying to speak out against this, and they're not going to be taken as seriously or as legitimized about it because of the ways in which we interact with certain things like that, because you can't see yourself in the people that are being further disenfranchised through this industrial inundation. And yeah, other things too, like, do they have the social power to make their concerns heard and actually be listened to by media outlets and the public at large? So that's kind of what I'm referring to, is like, if they don't have that social power already to make their concerns relevant to a statewide or even national landscape, then they're not really going to be heard. They're not going to be listened to or really heard out to the point that their concerns would be operationalized into actual change in policy. Do they have the financial power to fight these issues in the legal system? You know, like, do they have the ability to, constantly show up to these public hearings or these meetings, or fund campaigns to educate their communities on the harms of these facilities, or to organize efforts against these facilities, or even the time and capacity to show up to the public comment forums and meetings to voice their concerns and influence environmental policy and regulation outcomes. And a lot of times, like I said, certain communities don't have those powers, those capitals to be able to tap into and just easily be like, no, we don't want you here. So that's why we see such environmental injustice.
Yeah. Social and financial capital, like you're just talking about, is so important in battling NIMBY-ism. And okay, so here's an issue that's really Louisiana specific, that I want to touch on. Like, what might you say to people, especially in Louisiana, who claim that these industries that are setting up these facilities, that are, kind of stirring the pot here, really taking advantage of these racial lines and divides that we already have in society? What would you say to them if they claim that they provide jobs to Louisianians? Because I think this is something that if you go anywhere in Louisiana, people actually believe this very, very deeply. And it's because it's in our neighborhood. We see it all the time. And so this is a big way in which Louisiana is different from other places in terms of environmental justice. Not only are these traditionally disenfranchised or marginalized groups not given seats at the table to vote on or to reject harmful development, such as oil and gas development, but they're also made to depend on that development, or so at least they're made to think so by those industries. Yeah. And I'm going to take this moment to debunk the myth that oil and gas is providing lots of jobs in Louisiana. We'll get more into that in detail. Yeah. But these facilities usually don't create as many local jobs as they would have local communities believe. They have very strong marketing teams. Yeah. Very strong. So nevertheless, Louisianians are made to swallow in a really alarming amount of corporate propaganda throughout their life. Yeah. I'm sure you've driven past one of those giant Shell billboards claiming that their industry is like the backbone of Louisiana. Sorry, kids, but I flick that billboard off every time I go past it. I scream things. Yes. Bad thing. It's honestly so just like a spit in the face of so many like Louisianians and like our rich culture. It's like, really, you're the rhythm of Louisiana. Meanwhile, we can't even access so many riverways because you're literally set up in there extracting your fossil fuels, your oils, and then basically keeping out the local community from being able to enjoy those riverways. Like, how are you saying that you're the rhythm of Louisiana? It's crazy because I'm pretty sure if they try to put that same billboard up in like Portland, Oregon, they would be drawn, like Shell would be drawn and quartered in the street, and I would show up to that with popcorn, but like, of course. Like they just wouldn't get away with that. And it was actually something that is a very marked difference from anywhere I've ever lived, like DC, San Francisco, just Virginia, all over the place in general. These things don't just appear out of nowhere. Like coming here, I was like, oh my goodness, you've got to be kidding me. But if you drive past that billboard every day and you have a job, you know, enough to keep your family stable and whatever, and you don't really think about it, you're sort of consuming that media throughout your whole life. So a lot of people do believe that oil and gas is really creating a lot of jobs in Louisiana. And like, to be honest, a lot of jobs, not a lot of people know people who have jobs in oil fields, dangerous jobs, things that we're going to continue to discuss later in this podcast on other episodes. But you're going to talk more about it. But
like honestly, that's the thing, is that like these industries really make you believe in places like Louisiana that we have to rely on them for our economy. And I'm like, obviously, like you mentioned it too, like supporting your family. We totally understand that like a lot of these jobs, they're like the ones that we feel like we have to take care of ourselves and our loved ones, our family members, you know.
Never the worker's fault.
Right, exactly. But like, firstly, you kind of, I think, touched on this a little bit, but like the communities that are hosting these toxic facilities, these industries that basically are like, these host communities are not even the ones that are receiving the jobs that these facilities are literally setting up in their backyard. Like they're not even getting those jobs.
And this is a hot take. What you're saying right now. That's wild. This is a hot take.
That's wild to me, because it's like, you know, there is research on it. There are studies that say, these jobs are not going to the communities that they're setting these facilities up in. And so it's like, how are you gonna have these communities bear the burden of the pollutants, of the exposure to these emissions? Basically create, like, these industries are setting up as a parasite in these communities, but then furthermore not even giving them the jobs like that they claim to create for the community.
There's so much literature out there that says that they don't create that many jobs, but you know who that literature is marketed to? It's in academic journals and stuff. It's for nerds like us, so we can read it and be like, oh no, and let's tell people about it.
Exactly. And that's what, you know, we're trying to do here, because like it's a farce. Like, it's not true. They're just not creating all these awesome jobs, and they're not feeding into our economy all that greatly, like at least not in a way that other industries wouldn't be able to as well, and while simultaneously not contributing to climate change and spilling oil in our oceans.
Do you have any industry in mind?
Like, you know, I mean, like, for instance, the tourism industry. Like, I think about it all the time. Like, I feel like ecotourism, even just ecotourism, not even talking about like tourism generally speaking, which, you know, places like New Orleans, they see a lot of tourism, but like even ecotourism, like imagine if these riverways weren't so cut off and divided by companies like Shell and Exxon. Like, imagine if we could have like more of a focus on like hiking and kayaking, paddleboarding, things like that. There would be so many amazing things that so many people could do through ecotourism. And that's the thing too, is that like, you know, not even just like touching on tourism broadly, that's the thing, is that like tourism is a way more lucrative industry than the fossil fuel industry, especially for Louisiana, because the money that is being made from that industry is literally going back to Louisiana, whereas the fossil fuel industry, which is literally just setting up, like I said, as a leech in our communities, they suck all of our resources, pollute all of the people and the environments that they surround themselves in, while simultaneously lining their own pockets. Like, the money is not going to us in the same way.
And those higher up people who are getting that money, they don't live in Louisiana.
Exactly.
They've never set foot here.
Yeah. And then like you think about all like the workforce like layoffs that they have, or just like the moments whenever they just like cut down their workforce by a significant amount, and then
blame environmental advocates.
Yeah, but like honestly, it's just for a profit margin at the end of the day, just so that they can give themselves pay raises. And like, also, let's talk about like the tax cuts that these industries receive just to literally set up as parasites in our state. Like, they're not even paying into our public infrastructures. So realistically, their existence in our state, which is not only simultaneously harming our people, but also harming all of us at large by contributing so greatly to climate change, their existence in our state is genuinely only serving a very small amount of people, and they are not representative of the people that live in Louisiana. So the connection that people have felt to these industries is not because they're the rhythm of Louisiana. It's because we've had their propaganda shoved down our throats so much that now we believe that our livelihoods hinge upon their existence in our state. But it actually, yes, our livelihoods do hinge on their existence. And it's the fact that if they were to not be here, we would be living a much better existence. We would not have to worry about such high incidences of cancer, environmental degradation, and then the fact that we're starting to have to deal with such intense weather events like hurricanes and extreme heat waves. I mean, like literally, look at what happened this past summer. It was so hot. People didn't even have like the ability to keep their homes cool because of all the things that we're dealing with that are caused by anthropogenic climate change, which are caused by fossil fuel industries that should not have a place here in Louisiana.
Right, absolutely. And it's like our policymakers, the people who, have seats at the table, they're like inviting these industries to come in. Corporations do not pay taxes in Louisiana.
Right.
They're considered like a public service.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, thank you guys. So this is like, what we're talking about today is like the result of that, because all of our policymakers are like, hey, ExxonMobil, come set up in our backyard. We want you to go right on the river just so that we can pollute a water source. We love that. We love to see it. This reminds me of a meme that I saw.
Everything comes back to a meme.
It always comes back to, I think it was by Together Louisiana. I hope that was correct. So thank y'all for y'all sass. We love to see it. It was like, what do you want? What makes you, oh gosh, I'm getting this wrong. It was like, what makes you happier when you wake up in the morning? Is it Folgers in your cup, or is it Folgers paying their taxes? So that's just a coffee company. And I'm sure they have their own issues, but they also are set up on the Mississippi River.
Yeah.
I'm just like, why aren't they paying taxes to be there?
Like for what? Like not only are they
taxes,
they're extracting so much, but then also they're not paying into our public infrastructures. Like what? Yeah, it makes no sense.
Just needed to pause there because that's just like wild to me.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah, no, that makes me think of a meme too, because I was actually like thinking about it.
Let's just talk about, let's do a whole episode on climate memes.
You might have seen it, you might not have, but there's this basically like this scene where there's this farmer who's talking about his work, being a farmer, and like how he basically says it's not much, but it's honest work. And I think about fossil fuel industries and I'm like, flip that around, like flip it and reverse it. It's not honest work, but it's much.
It's so extra. It's just like so extra
because it serves them so much, but who does it serve for us at the end of the day? It doesn't really serve anybody except for a very small select few.
Yes, that is not the rhythm of Louisiana. Not at all. Okay, and I'm gonna come in here with what's not really a hot take because I'm not from here. So Louisiana has so much culture and history to offer the curious traveler. Like feeding back into that idea of like tourism really does support way more jobs and the economy of Louisiana. So the curious traveler has a lot to do in Louisiana, and as a coastal ecologist, I feel actually really privileged to work in the natural systems we have here. The swamps, the marshes, and the bayous are like so vast and so much more beautiful than I've ever seen anywhere else in the U.S. It's honestly it's like an underrated place to go.
Yes.
And my favorite thing to see that I've seen so far is probably when you're going somewhere early in the morning and you see that fog rising off of the bayou. It's like it gives you the tingly feeling, and it's so mysterious and it's a little haunting, and it's just something that few other states in the U.S. can offer. Actually, I can't commit. I'm sure it happens in other places, but like it happens reliably here, and it's so beautiful. And even aside from the natural environment, which is amazing, everyone should visit. I mean, we're just like, I'm sorry, we actually don't work for the tourism industry. I just want to be clear. We're just really big fans of the state. So aside from the natural environment, Louisiana also has like this very overwhelming culture of celebration.
Yes.
That's something I've noticed.
For sure.
Other places just don't celebrate like we do here.
Right.
And it's everything from an early fall football game to the parades that happen so much, so many
So
parades,
often.
to just a casual drink after work surrounded by friends and laughter.
Yes.
There's this like appreciation of ordinary things in life, and like you just celebrate every little thing, and I think that's really beautiful. So that's the Louisiana, everybody. It's actually not Shell,
Right.
It's not the fossil fuel companies that are laying waste the land, poisoning the residents, many of whom own this land, have go back generations beyond like what we can even imagine.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I love that you say that, because like that's the thing, is that like a lot of times like what we are known for, what they make movies about, what they feature in like in different film and media, is literally the culture and like the deep sense of celebration that we have in places like Louisiana, and the community that we
also have vampires.
That's so funny. I haven't seen one yet, but maybe that's just because
you're not hitting up the right bars.
Yeah, I think so. My God, like that's a thing. Literally, it's like you hear so much about places like New Orleans and like how like deeply rooted the culture is, and like places like Lafayette. Even like I went to UL for my undergrad. Like the celebrations that we have in places like that, and just the deeply entrenched culture that we have is just like, it's so beautiful. And I feel like places like Shell and Exxon and Mobil, like they basically make it seem as if we're just this like blank slate that they basically just get to come in and interject whatever they think that we are onto us, basically be like, oh, we're your rhythm, because they've stolen so much from us. They've stolen so much of our resources, so much of our land. They've literally taken people's like ancestral lands and turned them into a waste ground, like a landfill, quite literally. And it's just like, it's so frustrating, because like I said, at the end of the day, it's not even benefiting us to have them here, not at least in the large scheme of things. It's not benefiting us in the way that they would have us believe. And that's the thing, is that people come here for our culture and our rich history, which is driven by the very diversity that these polluting industries prey on to profit from. And you know, there's a whole lot of issues that come with those toxic emissions, like kind of what I was referring to earlier. There are all these health issues that come with exposure to them, especially at the rates that Louisiana environmental justice communities are exposed to them. What they experience, these communities near toxic sites have reported adverse pregnancy outcomes, liver function and renal disease abnormalities, excess bladder, lung, and stomach cancer, and leukemia cancer, and symptoms such as headaches, sleepiness, respiratory symptoms, psychological conditions, and gastrointestinal problems. And like even those things that are like just like things that don't even sound that serious, like, oh, you know, respiratory symptoms, like those types of things, like psychological conditions, gastro issues, respiratory problems, sleepiness, and headaches, those are all issues that can even prevent people from going into work, or prevent kids from going into school, and impact graduation rates, which of course then in turn impacts job and post-secondary education access opportunities. And these symptoms can affect children with greater consequences at such developmental stages, and lead to longer term health impacts, because they are at such formative years, like they're experiencing these things at such formative years. And again, these impacts only serve to further limit their capital and the capacities of these already stretched thin communities, because which again can serve to make it easier for industries to take advantage of these communities and set up their toxic operations there, because once again, like I said, their capital is limited, because they're dealing with all these health issues that are literally coming from having these industries there. And then by virtue of those industries being there and causing those health issues, then it allows the opportunity for more industries to set up and cause more issues and wreak more havoc.
It's all cycle.
Yes.
Scary. Yeah. Wow. That's it's so intersectional, and it just clearly serves to keep those already marginalized communities even further marginalized. Like all of those health, and I'm just sitting here thinking about all those health impacts that you're talking about, like those big things that are terrifying, and then that also cause medical problems that put you into debt even more, things like that. It's all connected. But those little things that build up over time, the headaches, the having a hurt stomach, being a kid. You should be lively and have a lot of energy.
Exactly.
Being tired all the time like that is just, it's not fair. It's exactly what the HEPA is here to protect.
Right.
Like, I'm just gonna call y'all out. You know your job.
You know what you're
most
supposed
of you
to do
your job.
Yeah.
You're good scientists, good regulatory bodies. Like, that is what the EPA is here for. And we're just talking about, like, we want to highlight that that's your right. Your right is to a clean environment, and a lot of people around here don't have that.
Yeah, that's
that right. It's not like a benefit. It's not like a thing that we strive to do. It's a right.
Yeah, exactly. It's something that we have the right to as citizens, like you said. And that's the thing, is like you mentioned that it was so intersectional, and that's really what makes it so sinister, is that it's all these compounding issues that are intersectional and systemic. And when those things are systemic, especially racialized and class driven, they can be so undetectable because there's no direct aggressor necessarily that you can say is being racist or classist. It's just that there are these deeply entrenched systems that keep certain groups repressed and unable to relieve themselves of their community, of their disenfranchisement, because of a lot of these factors that can't be so easily disentangled, like what we were mentioning, the health issues, the impacts that the health issues have on social capital and on political capital, things like that, political clout. And yeah, unless you're engaging with the literature constantly and like reading every single report, like you said,
nobody has time for that.
Yeah, no. Unless you're engaging with the literature literally day in and day out, then you're not going to be able to really easily disentangle those such intersectional and such deeply entrenched racialized classist systems that recreate this oppression on a daily basis. And honestly, that's what we're hoping to be here for. There's so many things that are interconnected with environmental justice, and that's what Climate Pelicans care about so much, and why our mission really rides heavily on the idea of environmental justice. It's connected to climate issues and larger social issues that we see that recreates systemic oppression on a daily basis.
Say it, queen. Yeah, so that just that kind of wraps up what we wanted to talk about today. We hope you enjoyed us laying the groundwork for environmental justice. We look forward to continuing in interviews and highlighting a lot of nonprofit work that's been going on in Louisiana that does sort of address these issues, or really does address these issues. So stay tuned for that. Hopefully we gave you just a little bit of groundwork understanding, things like a framework that you can build your understanding off of as we get more into specific things. So thanks for hanging out with us. Our final bit that we love to do is our calls to action, otherwise known as calls to action, things you can do that we like to plug. It's pretty basic right now. Since we're just getting this podcast off the ground, you can email us with questions and comments at climatepelicans@gmail.com. That's all lowercase, all one word. Plus follow our social media. That's at Climate Pelicans on Instagram and at Divest LSU on Twitter. If you have any specific issues or questions that you would like to cover on this pod, you want us to cover it, give our hot takes, feel free to reach out to us through any of those channels. We absolutely love your listener mail.
Yes, definitely. We love hearing from y'all.
Yeah, so we'll wrap it up. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks.